One of the main reasons to use QForm is validation. It allows you to trigger validation on all the fields within it and block the user from making a request if there are any errors. So this is a really helpful component. We'll start by building a basic native form using plain HTML, and then we'll convert it to a Quasar QForm with Quasar inputs. So we'll come in here and say form, and form can now accept action, which is going to be where the form is submitting to. I'm just going to submit it to the current page that we're on, localhost 8080. You can make that whatever you wanted. So this would be your backend server, for example. Now, another thing I'll do is add the method. Usually this will probably be a post. We're going to use a GET request because GET requests allow us to basically inspect what the form looks like with a query string. And you can see that whilst I was practicing for this video, I've got one there from before. So we'll get rid of that. And do note that this is not Quasar code. This is all just plain HTML type code. Next, we'll put some inputs in there. So let's say input here, and we'll just leave that as an empty input. How about a text area? And I might just make this a self-closing tag, and both of these will need a name as well. So this one, I'll give it a name of body, and then this one will have a name of title. So this name is what's going to be sent to the server. In other words, the value inside of input will be sent to the server as title. I almost said name, as title. The value inside the text area will be sent to the server with the name body. Okay, moving on. Another thing I'll do here is say class is equal to column. So this is a Quasar class, and it's going to just make the form a little bit easier to see. Let's see what we've got so far. There we go, the title and then the body. Now we can say here as a placeholder, maybe something like your post. And then the title will also have a placeholder equal to post title, just so it's a bit more obvious for the user. There we go. So the next thing we need is a button that actually submits the form. And this is just going to be a normal button. And then I'll come in here and set the type equal to submit. Now, by setting the type to submit, what we're doing is telling the button that it's inside of a form. And when we click on it, it's going to submit the action on this form. In other words, when I click on this button, I want you to do a GET request to this endpoint. Once again, this is not Quasar code. This is just plain HTML code. There's a good chance you've learned this in the past. Now let's set this to submit, save it, and now we've got our button. Let's try putting a title in here, my title, some body, and submitting that. And there we go. It submits to the page, and we can see that that has worked. Now let's turn this into a Quasar form. We'll say here Q-form. And for this input, we'll make it a Quasar input, Q-input. And the text area, for Quasar, we just use a Q-input and set the type equal to text area. So that's basically the equivalent of a text area. And for the button, we'll say Q-button. And you can put submit directly in the button, or you could set that equal to the label property here, which is usually what I like to do. Label is equal to submit. And I'll get rid of what's inside of there. Then we can just make it a self-closing tag. All right, I don't know how this snuck in there. Let's get rid of that. Oh, we're getting some weird styling. And I believe it's because I didn't have a self-closing tag on this input. All right, there we go. And next, let's make this a little bit easier to sort of see where the form is. And I'll do that by saying class is equal to Q-padding, or we've already got the class there, Q-padding or medium, and we'll give it a shadow equal to 2. Now, by default, this QForm component actually isn't doing anything. In fact, check this out. It's kind of similar to the code we had before. If I come in here and jump into the form, yeah, notice that it's literally just a form component. And then inside of there, let's go down to the button component. Here it is here. And notice that we've got the type equal to submit, as I've set it here. So really, we have pretty much the exact same example as before. Quasar is just adding a little bit of styling and making it look nicer. Now, there is one thing that we need to do in order to get this to work, and that is to model something on these fields. So v-model is equal to, I'll say form.title, and we'll create that in a moment. And let's do the same thing for the text area. v-model is equal to, how about form.body? Save it, and now I'll come down here and say const form is equal to a ref, import ref. That'll be an object which is going to have a title, nothing by default, and a body which is also nothing by default. All right, so now that that's modeling, we should be able to do basically the exact same thing we did before. Let's get rid of that, the query string at the top. Title, body, submit, and there we go, it gets sent through. This is a native form submit. We're basically just using pure HTML to submit this form. Now, as I mentioned at the start, we actually have validation available with the QForm component. So right now it's doing nothing, but if I come in here and then say rules, we can now add some validation rules. And I talk about adding validation rules in the QInput video, but let's just do a quick rundown here. We can take the value and then say, hey, if the value exists and the value.length is greater than 0. So if this passes as true, then nothing's going to happen. It's just going to, well, show nothing at all. Otherwise, and we can use the OR operator here to otherwise return a string. And if we get a string, then this is considered to be in an error state. For example, please type something. I really like this syntax. We basically just have a function that is the rule, and if that fails, then it returns the string. And if Quasar gets that string back, it knows that it's an error. So check this out. If I now try and submit the form, we get an error there saying, please type something. If we type something, it now works. Now what we could do is cut this, and then I could come down here and save that rule down here by saying function is equal to, how about required rule? And actually, let's just make that a const, because then we can say required rule is equal to, and just paste that directly in there. Now, if I save it, yeah, I'm getting a couple of errors here. It just wants me to distinguish what's happening here between the OR operator. So I'll just wrap that in parentheses, and now it should work. So now we can use this required rule and just whack it directly in this rules array and copy paste it down here and say that the body is also required. Submit runs this rule and it fails, so now we can type something in there. Submit runs this rule and it fails, type something in there, and now it's going to work. Let's add a bit of flair here. How about we say color is equal to indigo. Very nice. Another thing we have available to us is resetting the rules. So if I copy paste this button down and change it to reset, and then set the type equal to reset, and let's get rid of the color there and maybe just make it flat. Now we've got a reset button, submit, we get an error. If I click on reset, it removes the error. So that's kind of cool to know. You can easily reset those errors with a button. Now next, we're going to add just a little bit of JavaScript to basically allow us to hook into this form request, just in case we want to basically run some logic before the request is sent. Let me show you how we can do that. We can come up here and say @submit. So when the form is submitted to the page, I want you to call a function called onSubmit. Let's go ahead and copy that. Coming down here, we can now build out that function. Function onSubmit, and we're going to receive an event in there. In order to submit the form, we can say event.target. That's going to give us the underlying form, and then we can just call submit on it. So let's save it, open our console so we can look out for any errors we might run into, and see if that works. So submit, nothing happens because we get the validation hitting, and so it's not actually going to call this function. So let's put some text in there and there, submit, and there we go. Essentially what we've done is the exact same thing, but now we're taking control here in JavaScript. So what we could do is run a check here, and if it fails, not submit the form. I'll show you what I mean. Let's come up here and then say, I'm just going to separate this out so it's easier for you to see. We'll come in here and say q-toggle, and this will v-model accepted EULA, and EULA stands for End User License Agreement. And we'll put that on the form, so form.accepted EULA, and how about a label equal to I accept the license and terms. All right, that'll do. Now we've got that toggle in there. Let's set a default value on it. So I've copied that, accept EULA, scrolling down, whack it in here, and by default, I'm going to set it equal to false. So now what we can do is just run a quick check on this accepted EULA boolean. For example, if form.value.accepted EULA, and if the user did not accept it, we're just going to return here. And by returning here, that means that the form will not submit. However, in the real world, you'd want to give a little bit of feedback and basically say, hey, you need to accept the license agreement, but let's just check if we can get this working for now. So submit, we get an error here. Let's type some stuff in, submit, and it did not submit to the page. Let me get rid of this just to prove it. And there we go. It didn't submit to the page. I can click this all day long. But if we accept the agreement, it now submits. So this is one of the benefits of using a function here. We can now tap in and do a little bit of extra validation or bits and pieces that we might need to do before submitting the form. Next up, we have custom form validation. So if I come up here, and when I say custom form validation, I mean we're going to call the validate function ourselves. And this is how you get total control over a form. So if we get rid of type submit, and we'll get rid of type reset as well, scrolling up here, I'm even going to get rid of this @submit function, and we're going to add a ref here. So basically what I want to be able to do is tap into this component and call a function on it. We'll call this form component, and in order to be able to access that, I now have to come down here and then say const form component is equal to an empty ref. And now that's going to latch onto our form component. This is something that Vue does behind the scenes for us. Now what we can do is say, hey, when you click on this submit button, I want you to call that on submit function. So we're doing things manually now. We're saying, hey, I'm going to basically handle the submit myself. And again, because we got rid of type is equal to submit, because we removed this from the button, the form is not going to submit when we click on this button by default. So let's save that. And I'm also going to want something for reset as well. So at click, we'll say on reset. There we go. So coming down here, let's get rid of this event.target. Obviously, the event.target is no longer a form. We just have a button now, so we can't actually deal with the event in the same way anymore. Let's get rid of this. And what else can we do? I might get rid of that as well. And we also need the reset function. So let's copy paste that down and say on reset here. Now let's just do a console.log to check that's working. On submit, and same thing with the reset. On reset. Save it. And now let's come down here and submit the page. And notice if I get rid of this, we can submit this page. There's no validation happening. This is basically just normal pressing of a button. So now the form, we've basically removed the validation functionality out of the form. Now we can bring it back in to have total control like this. We'll come in here and say form component dot value. So essentially here, I'm now tapping into our QForm component, and we're going to call manually the validate method. So let's save that and see if it works. And there we go. We've basically brought validation back in by calling validate directly on the form. Let's do the same thing with resetting the form. And I think this is called reset validation. Let's try that. And now submit, we get the error. And now reset works as well. And what we can do now is say .then and find out whether or not it was successful by saying success, because we'll receive whether or not it's successful as a Boolean. And let's just console.log success there to see what it looks like. Here we go. Submit. Success is false. That did not pass validation. And now let's enter some stuff in, submit, and now success is true. And by the way, validation rules can actually be promises. And that's why we've got .then. So for example, one of these rules could be const check username is used, and that would return a promise, and that promise would resolve to either true or false. And then if it's true, then it passes validation. If it's false, it fails validation. So that's why we have .then here to allow for extra flexibility. By the way, I think that also means we could do this. Let's get rid of that. We'll make this an async function, and we could say const success is equal to whatever we get back from that. And now let's do a console.log on success here. Yeah, because you might rather use async await. Oh no, right, we're actually getting a promise back here. So looks like validate. Oh, this needs to be awaited. Await. There we go. Yeah, so you can use async await here if you prefer. And I think that actually looks a bit cleaner in this scenario. Let's change gears for a second. I'm going to scroll up. One thing you might want to do with QForm is remove a lot of the native stuff like autocorrect, auto-capitalize, autocomplete, and spell checking. Sometimes that kind of stuff can be a little bit annoying depending on the type of form that you have. So in this example, it probably wouldn't make sense because I would want my phone to do automatic capitalization, spell checking, and stuff like that. However, there might be situations where this is code, for example. So if you're going to be putting code inside of here, you would want to remove that functionality. So let's see how you can do that. Autocorrect, we can set that equal to off. Another one we have is auto capitalize. We can set that to off. We've also got autocomplete. We can set that to off. And then another one would be spell check. And this one isn't actually off, it's just false. So if you need to, you might want to come in here and disable that. But just be careful messing with these values because you want to make sure that the user still has a really good experience with your app. And so if they're trying to use it and their spell checking isn't working or their autocorrect isn't working, sometimes that can really annoy the user. So just be careful setting these settings. All right, removing them, let's move on. Next, I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the things we can use in QForm. Now, a lot of Quasar components that accept data, like the Q input, are going to have a name property. And that means that you can submit the form natively by setting the name field. And lots of Quasar components have this. QSelect, QSlider, range, color, toggle, checkbox from radio, button group, the date picker component, the time picker. All of these components have a name property here. And by setting that name property, you can do a native submit of the form. So if you're submitting your form and the data isn't being sent to your backend, there's a good chance you need to set the name property on some of your inner fields. All right, so that's pretty much it for QForm. The last thing I'm going to show you is something a bit more custom. So most of you can probably stop the video here, but if you're interested, I'll show you how you can actually make your own component that works with QForm. So as you might imagine, a lot of these inner components like QInput, QSelect, the date picker, they all follow a consistent API that has functions like validate, reset validation, and then what QForm does is it calls those functions on the component. So what we can do is make our own components that adhere to that API, or you could call it a contract that adhere to that contract. And by doing that, we're able to essentially create our own components that work inside of a QForm. And Quasar offers a really nice composable to allow us to do that easily. Okay, let's have some fun. Opening my console, control backslash, let's say Quasar, new component, and we're going to call this component over 18 slider. This is going to be a slider component that just checks that the user is over 18. Oh, it already exists because I did this earlier. Let's go ahead and delete that component. Yes, I do practice for these videos. And then run that again. So now if we jump into our over 18 slider, I'm going to do a couple of things here to set it up how I like it. Change this to script setup, remove what's on the inside, and then hold Alt and then hold up to move script to the top because I prefer script to be above template. And this is becoming a common practice these days where people have script and then they'll have template. And I really like it. So first things first, let's build out the slider. We'll come in here and say Q-slider. And actually, I think I want to wrap that in a div. So how about we put this inside of a div? Q-slider. And then inside of here, we're going to send through the model value. We can do that by saying model-value. And if you don't understand what I'm doing here, this is kind of more advanced view stuff. If you want to understand this code, then you might want to have a look at how Vue uses vModel under the hood. Now we'll come in here and we'll send through our model value. And in order to get that, I'm going to accept it in the props. Const props is equal to define props. And I want the model value sent through there. The type is a number. And let's set the default equal to, well, I don't need a default. I think I'll just make it required. Now I want to bind the attributes of the parent onto this slider. So v-bind is equal to adders. This basically means any attributes that are passed down to this over 18 slider component are going to be injected directly into the slider. This means that any of slider's properties are now available to the parent to be used. So, for example, if I were to say over 18 slider and then send through label, then that label property would be sent through here with the vbind attribute. Okay, anyway, if you're going this deep, chances are you know that already. So let's move on. Next, I'm going to show some errors if we're in an error state. So this is going to be a very naive example just to get you started. We'll say v-if, and how about we have an invalid variable that lets us know if it's valid or not. And we'll have a class that's equal to text-red so that it's obvious it's an error. Now we can come in here, and I'm just going to hard code an error for now. Must be over 18. Usually you'd have a selection of errors and you'd pick the right one depending on the scenario. But for now, let's just hard code an error directly in there. All right, so now we need to have this invalid. So let's say invalid is equal to a ref. And how about we set this to false by default? We're going to assume that it's valid by default, so we'll set it to false. And now we want to have a function for validating this. So let's say function validate, and then we can say invalid.value is equal to, and we want to check if this model value is valid. So how about props.model value is less than or equal to 18? Actually, just less than 18. All right, so if the value of this slider is less than 18, it's going to be set to an invalid state when we call validate. And now Quasar is going to want us to return a Boolean here. So let's return here. Well, I think we can just directly return the opposite of invalid value. So in other words, whether or not it is valid. Maybe invalid wasn't the best word. Maybe I should have used valid instead, because now I feel like we're kind of reversing things and flipping. Anyway, that looks like that's going to work. Here's the fun part. This is the composable I was talking about before that Quasar gives us. Import, and we're going to pull this out of Quasar, use form child. That's what the composable's called, and that's coming out of Quasar. Add from there. And now we can come down here, and this is the last part. We'll use the use form child composable, and we'll send validate through. Validate will be equal to our validate function. Since that's the same word, I can get rid of that. And the other thing I'll do is have a reset validation function. Actually, let's just test that it works so far. Control P, jump into our index page, and let's actually use this component. Coming down here, what do we call it? Over 18 slider. Now we'll say v-model is equal to form dot, how about age? And now we actually need that age property. So let's come down here, and then we'll add it in there. Age is equal to 0 by default. Save it. Let's refresh the page. And there we go. We've got our slider. And let's see if this works. That's coming through as true. So what have I done wrong here? Oh, probably because it was a high enough age. Let's make it really low. And enter some values here. And it works. Must be over 18. How cool is that? So the next thing I'm going to do after validate is have a way to reset the validation, because currently that's not going to work because Quasar doesn't know how to reset validation on this component. We can do that by saying reset validation. I'm just going to do this inline. How about we just say invalid.value is equal to false. I think it's actually that simple. So let's try this. Submit and reset. It works. Now, another one that we have available to us is requires QForm. So if I set that equal to true, refresh the page, let's try this again. All right, everything's working. And what requires QForm does is it checks that this component is inside of a QForm component. Currently it is, and so it's not complaining. But if that was outside of a QForm component, it would complain. So check this out. Index page, and we'll go to our over 18 slider. I'm going to cut that, and then I'm going to paste it outside of our QForm component. And now it's going to give us an error saying, hey, this over 18 slider needs to be inside of a QForm. That's why we're getting this error here. So there you go. That's Quasar's QForm component. Hope you enjoyed this one. I had a lot of fun. There was a lot of cool stuff to discover in this component that I didn't know about. So hopefully you got something out of this too. All right, I'll see you in the next video.